I am here with Dr. Koenraad Elst. Dr. Elst, it's a real pleasure for me to have you on because I have been meaning, and if you talk to people in my friend circle, I've been talking to them about you for almost a couple of years now. But I'm very, very happy that I've had the chance to have you on my show. So, welcome to the show, first and foremost.
My pleasure.
So, Dr. Elst, tell me a little bit about your background and how you got interested in studying India in the first place.
My background, my professional background is simple, or maybe not so simple. Namely, my degree is called Oriental Philologist and Historian.
Right.
So that's what I do, which means, I have MA degrees in Chinese studies,
Right.
in Indo-Iranian studies,
Huh.
and in philosophy. So that's a good background, I think, to tackle these issues.
Yeah. What are Indo-Iranian studies?
Well, it means that I've also studied Persian and Iranian culture and so on.
Okay.
Now, that I've not done much with it. In the 90s, I still used to read some of the many Persian texts about medieval India, about Muslim India. But that's long ago. I think my Persian is not much anymore.
Can you read it still?
Well, I can vocalize it, but I can't always understand.
Right.
I can look it up. It's an open book, but still,
Right.
it's not fluent anymore. I just don't really do it anymore. As you grow older, you sort of get more focused. You know exactly what you want, and this is such a large field that I doubt I'll ever be doing much else.
Right. That's fair.
So, however, let me correct the question in one word. I am not so much interested in India. I'm interested in Sanatana Dharma,
Right.
which is not exactly the same thing. Indeed, you see, when I had finished my studies back in Belgium,
Right.
it would be, in the normal course of things to go to India. And yet, you see, at the time I had a nasty chronic disease for a whole year.
Right.
And, then I thought, well, India is the country of malaria and cholera and so on. Why should I go there? In America, you have all these academic philosophers who study the German philosophers.
Right.
Yet, that doesn't mean they go to Germany. Or all those who study the Greek philosophers, I've never been to Greece. I can
Right.
tell you about Heraclitus and Socrates and so on, but I never been to Greece.
Right.
So I thought, well, why go to India? And all these books are available in any Western library. So, but then I went to India anyway, and then it was love at first sight, and then I kept going there.
Right. And when you say interest in India is different from interest in Sanatana Dharma and both are not the same, how do you differentiate the two?
Well, a thought form is universal.
Right.
In principle, anyone could have thought of Atma and Brahma and so on. So, you can do that anywhere. Now you see on the internet, you see all these pictures of people in Latin America doing Hinduism.
Yeah.
And so on. So, well, and it's already in the past. You see, like Bali wasn't originally Hindu, it became Hindu.
Yeah.
Why not?
Right.
So,
I see what you mean.
whereas India, well, you see, India is not coterminous with Dharma. On the one hand, you have many expatriates, people of Indian origin elsewhere. Then you have quite a few converts. Then in India itself, of course, you have very many who are not Hindu, who are emphatically not Hindu.
Right.
So the two are not coterminous.
Fair.
And if my interest had only been in philosophy, then perhaps I still wouldn't care about India. Unfortunately, yeah, it is while there that I noticed this whole communal situation and how it is completely misunderstood in the West.
Right.
And so then I got interested in India as, what is happening today. And so I started following the news about India. I mean, this was in Benares in the university when I was around 1990.
Right.
And so, every morning I bought a few newspapers. And then I went to the river, to the Ganga.
Yeah.
I took off my shoes and I stood just in the river. I mean, like knee height,
Right.
the water, and so there I went to read my newspapers.
That's a good place to read.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so it was the time of the Ayodhya Affair,
Yeah.
and it was first of all the time of the Rushdie Affair. That's how it started.
What was that like? What was that like watching that in real time? Because I obviously have no idea. I was too little.
Yeah, well, in the beginning there was no Rushdie Affair. There was an Ayodhya Affair,
Yeah.
and as part of it, there was some Hindu event going to take place in Ayodhya, and the Muslim leader Syed Shahabuddin announced a Muslim march on Ayodhya to coincide with that event.
Wow.
And so the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi thought, well, this is going to be a bloodbath. So he invited Syed Shahabuddin, saying, what do you want in order to call off this march? And so among Shahabuddin's demands was the banning of the then freshly published Salman Rushdie book, The Satanic Verses.
Oh.
Now, that in itself was not the news, but what really caught my attention was that there was no unity among the so-called secularists. And so the hardliners, who are not religious by themselves, the communists, were against the ban of the book. Whereas the Congressites, M.J. Akbar, Khushwant Singh, and so on, they favored the ban. And so this was bizarre to me, coming from the West, where secularism, in this case, would imply supporting freedom of expression, supporting Salman Rushdie. So here there were a number of people who were talking very sophisticated. Oh yeah, but there's a difference. And I'm all for freedom of speech, but...
Yeah, there's always a but.
Yeah. So that caught my attention. And so then I started following it more closely, and then I rolled into the Ayodhya Affair. I for instance, I went to interview Syed Shahabuddin. I phoned him, and so he agreed. But then when I got there, his secretary told me that he was busy and I had to wait a while.
Right.
And now he's at prayer, and there was always something, and then he was gone, or that's what she said.
Right.
So clearly he had changed his mind. I don't know why, because I was not known at the time at all.
Yeah.
So, he didn't, have any
was the
special
BHU
information.
label something that scared him off?
Oh, I'm not sure I even told him that. No, I don't think it is anything he knew about me. Well, anyway, but so I really did want to talk to him. I mean, I did want to inform myself from all sides. And anyway, he had this paper called Muslim India that contained a reproduction of all the press articles that fitted his narrative, and then much comment by himself. So already that was good information.
Right.
But that was still fairly available. You see,
right.
the pro-Muslim side or the anti-Hindu side, you could easily find in the ordinary papers. And, papers like the Times of India and so on, they were just very strongly anti-temple. But so then I had to go to, first it started with the RSS office, John Devala in Delhi. They had a bookshop there, Suruchi Prakashan.
Mm.
Uh, but I don't know. I was disappointed. I thought that, you see, we already knew in the West about Muslim fundamentalism,
Mm.
after the Iranian Revolution. And so I thought that Hinduism being a lot more colorful than Islam, probably their fundamentalism is also going to be a lot more interesting than the Islamic version. But that was not the case at all. It was something very mechanical, regimented about the RSS approach.
Right.
And then, um, so there was something in Varanasi. I lost my passport. I had to go to the embassy in Delhi
Mm.
and to collect new papers. So I was back in Delhi for a few days. So I went to Shahabuddin. But I also, um, I just passed my time. You see, I heard that there was this, publishers area, Daryaganj. So
Right.
I went to the bookshops there. And then, totally by coincidence, I found this book, History of Hindu-Christian Encounters by Sitaram Goel.
Mm.
And I read that at one stretch. Next day I went back and not with any purpose in mind, only to see what more was available. And so this bookseller, Mr. Uppal, said, well, if you want, you can talk to the author. He lives just down the
Oh,
block here, or he works there. And so he arranged the meeting, and so we spent the afternoon together. And he explained to me everything about the Ayodhya Affair. Totally new. There's a total new world opening up. And well, then from there, the rest is history.
right. Wow, that's amazing. So, do you think that coming to India, you got a better sense because one of the complaints that people make about Indology, especially Western Indology, and the way they look at India. Do you think that your view of India and I suppose Sanatana Dharma in your case would have been very different had you not come to India personally?
Of
How?
course, you see,
Yeah,
Westerners who are interested in yoga, especially, and never go to India, they have this very idealized view of India.
yeah,
In fact, even many Westerners who do go to India, you see, in Indira Gandhi Airport in Delhi, when you come outside, like the very first thing, more or less, that you see is this stall of the prepaid taxi, you
mm,
know, organized by the Delhi police. Now, there you see, very regularly Westerners arriving with the colorful, extra Indian clothes and so on. And so they ordered a cab,
yeah,
directly to Rishikesh, and they go to their ashram and they spend a few weeks there, and they take back the taxi from Rishikesh to Delhi. And so you see quite a few of those Westerners who come to India for spirituality.
right.
They don't see anything of India except their ashram world.
Yeah.
And so they get a somewhat distorted view of what India is.
Yeah, certainly. And when I put out that I was going to be speaking to you, a couple of patrons also asked a couple of questions. It was regarding to this as well. This is a question from Glam Guju, who is one of the patrons of the show. He said, and this is in line with what I was trying to ask as well, that what explains the generally unsympathetic and patronizing sort of Western Indology's point of view towards Hindus and towards Dharma in general. And Narayanam had another question which was kind of attached to it as how are you able to recognize the misinterpretations that Western Indology often places when
Mhm.
discussing Dharma or when studying Dharma? What was different for you as compared to the general state of Western Indology?
Okay, what do Westerners have against Hinduism? the really basic thing, you see, most people don't know much about India, but in school, especially in religion class, in our days, we still had once in a while some missionary who was posted in India. He came back home for a month or so after 5 years. And, our religion teachers happened to be quite well introduced in those circles. So once in a while, a missionary came to speak in class.
Right.
One thing that they always talked about was the caste system.
Right, of course.
And so back then, you see, it was much from a Roman Catholic angle. Later, you see, in society, all the newspapers changed over to secular leftism. But then the emphasis was even more on the caste system.
Right.
But so Christians said, we have to get the people out of this benighted, miserable system. And this can only be done by conversion.
Right.
And so later they didn't speak so much of conversion. But at any rate, Hinduism had to be destroyed because otherwise the caste system would never go. So this caste inequality is the principal reason. And it also has to do with the experience of the abolition of slavery. You see, my country never had slaves, and it's not England or Holland or so. On the contrary, our only involvement with slavery was a war for the abolition of slavery against the Arab slave traders. This was
really?
in Congo. Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Now, this is not so much to praise the king at the moment, which was King Leopold II, because he was a horrible man. and so, after, in fact, he himself was not really in favor for the abolition of slavery, or in theory he was, but actually he did good business with the Arab slave traders.
Right.
And then it was some local military commander who, out of personal pride or so, he had a little conflict with the Arabs, and then he let it come to a war against his own orders. And so if he had lost the war, he would have been court-martialed and so on. But since he won the war, that gained the king a lot of sympathy worldwide, from anti-slavery societies and so on. So that gave him good press. Now, after that, however, he started, without slavery, but he started capitalist exploitation, and really to the hilt.
Right.
So many people died, not because he killed them. I mean, some people speak of genocide. No, there was no genocide, but his economic policies completely jeopardized the existing systems of agriculture and so on. So it was quite negative. And locals, who didn't comply, there was a lot of repression again, and many got killed, not always killed, but anyway, it was a very ugly man. It was a very ugly system. Also, it was partly an ugly system because after defeating the Arabs, he re-employed them in that very business at which they were expert, which was overseeing the native labor.
Right.
And so they applied a Sharia punishment. You see, if laborers didn't deliver the quota that had been imposed on them, they considered it as theft. And the Sharia punishment for theft is hacking a hand off. Right?
Right.
So from back then, you have these famous photographs of blacks with a hand chopped off.
Oh, goodness.
Yes. So you see that he is blamed for that. And of course, he has the ultimate political responsibility, though he never set foot in Congo.
Right.
But, the actual doing of this was of these local surveyors. So anyway, what I was saying is, so this is a case of, European people not doing slavery, but doing actual abolition of slavery.
Right.
Now, you see, others, of course, also the British first practiced slavery. Then they started abolishing slavery. And not only abolishing it in their own domain, but also pressurizing others to abolish it. Like in the Crimea War in 1855, thereabouts, they agreed to help the Turks against the Russians, but demanded in exchange from the Turks that they abolish slavery. And
Wow.
so in the actual Turkish domains that was done, not in their colonies in Arabia. Their slavery continued till 1962.
Wow.
But anyway, but so, like in America, for instance, there was a civil war actually in order to abolish slavery and so on. And so they take a certain pride in having abolished slavery. Now, because of this, they feel like, yeah, now we have to go to the end. Now we have to abolish slavery wherever it still exists. Now, the perception in the West is that the caste system is something like slavery.
Right.
At any rate, it's steep inequality. So that's I think the most general reason why outsiders are very distrustful of Hinduism. Then
Interesting.
a second reason in the Nehruvian Indira period was India's extreme poverty.
Hmm.
Now that poverty, of course, is not the doing of Hinduism. There are so many, Pakistani jokes about Hindu banyas and so on. Yeah. Now, of course, they are negative. They say that, Hindus are greedy and so on.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, they never deny that they are expert businessmen. And indeed, you see, Hindus left to themselves, when going to England, to America, and so on, they were a great success story economically. So if he didn't succeed in India, it was not because of Hinduism.
Right.
It was because of Nehruvian socialism. They called it, the low growth figures they used to call
The
the
Hindu
Hindu
rate
rate of growth, which was really the Nehru rate of growth.
of growth.
And so, you see, even though India had had a good start at independence, you see, the British had plundered India terribly,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, during the Second World War, India was their main center of production. So there was quite an industrial development going on, in spite of Gandhi and so on. And so India was off to a good start, and there was a lot of war debt that had to be paid by Britain to British India, that is later to independent India,
Right.
and so on. So India was off to a very good start. I mean, if you compare that to Korea, which was totally devastated and so on, India was on course. But then that Nehruvian socialism completely, and so people, when they saw on TV, people dying in the gutter in India, and they themselves don't do anything about it. They need Mother Teresa to come and pick them up from the
Of
gutter.
course.
That also contributed to the negative image
Yeah.
of Hinduism. And then the third reason, that didn't count in the 50s or so, but that counts now, is the sympathy in the West, at least by the Western elites, for Islam.
Mm.
So they treat Islam as a poor, hapless minority and so on.
Right.
And so not the people in general, but those who make the newspapers and so on, they strongly are biased in favor of Islam. And so automatically they treat Hinduism as the overbearing majority and so on.
Right. And where do you think that comes from? That sympathy towards Islam, does it come from the simple fact that the Western powers used to be colonizers of Islamic countries, and so these Islamic minorities that are now settled in the West, they're oppressed minorities, and we must look after them, and so that same model has then been applied to the Indian context?
Well, for Britain, that will probably count to quite an extent. They have a pretty globalist vision. That's like one of the good sides of colonialism.
Right.
I mean, if you compare Britain with America, for instance, Americans, in spite of their army being everywhere in the world, they have a very limited vision. So in Britain that and in France that plays a role. In a backwater like Belgium, I wouldn't say so. What played there was simply from the 1960s, we got these guest workers,
Yeah.
Gastarbeiter, from Turkey, from Morocco. And so, they were just coal miners and stuff like that. And so they were part of the proletariat as socialists saw it. That's where the sympathy started.
I see.
It also must be said that whereas in England there are many stories of racism, this is not the case at all in Belgium. You see, they integrated quite well among the other coal miners and so on. They were like welcomed, and then they were paternalistically also given cheap housing and so on by the coal mining companies. So they were, I don't know, they were not distrusted or so.
Right, I see.
And that gave a positive image to them, just as people, as Turks, as Moroccans, not so much as Muslims. And at the time, religion was at an all-time low. You see, in Europe itself, we saw the collapse of Christianity. And even where it did not collapse, still it was not a political factor.
Right.
It was there in society, and so people had the same impression about Islam. And indeed, Islam was at a low tide. Like, for instance, Gamal al-Nasser from Egypt, he mocked the wearing of the veil.
Yeah.
At the time, you see, Egypt was not what it is now.
Yeah.
And in our case, for instance, those who came from Turkey at the time was at the height of Atatürk secularism. So, religion wasn't much. It wasn't often not taught in school and so on. In Morocco, the people who came belonged to the Berber minority, originally majority. And so they also were often not very socialized in Islam. They did some of the rituals, often never went on Hajj because they didn't have the money. And they didn't speak Arabic, they spoke Berber. And they had their own local culture, much of it still surviving from pre-Islamic days.
Right.
So, Islam was not so much the issue. They also understood, being very poor, lowly people, they didn't have any grand designs on, in Europe we're going to bring Islam. No, they just adapted. They were a nervous minority.
Right.
So they had a good press. And so the left in the West evolved, keeping the sympathy for them, but the contents of that sympathy changed as that Muslim community became more Muslim. It became more Muslim because in their home countries, it also became more Muslim. And secondly, because they were in ever larger numbers. So they could set up their own community structures that weren't there in the beginning. So as that community became more Muslim, well, you see, leftism automatically became pro-Islamic.
Yeah.
Then another factor is many people walked out of the church. And in my day, it was less conflictual. You see, when the church was still an enormous power in our society, those who left often had a grudge against the church and supported anyone who was against the church, including Islam.
Right.
And so all the criticism that they had of religion, of superstition and so on, that they applied against Christianity, they did not apply against Islam.
Right.
So I think the Rushdie Affair was the last time, this was 1809, when a large section of the left still
revolted against Islam, against
Mm.
the Ayatollahs. Also because the Ayatollahs had a structure as a separate clergy, quite similar to the priesthood in Catholicism,
Yes.
so that they could still recognize, oh yeah, those are the enemies.
Those are the bad guys.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so
Wow.
it's around in the 90s, you also see the right-wing nationalist parties
Mm.
change or shift to becoming critical of Islam.
Right.
Until then, they were not, because they saw Islam as conservative. And, in terms of sexual morality, clearly they are. Then in the real rightist groups, there was also a strong anti-Semitism.
Mm.
So because they were against the Jews, they were against Israel, and they were in favor of the Palestinians.
Mm.
And like the really hard, the Nazi right,
Right.
you see, they remember that in the Second World War, many Muslim nations had sided with
Yes.
the Nazis. So, when those parties started shedding their anti-Semitism and becoming, Islam critical instead, then that was a signal to the left
The left. Yeah.
that because we are against the right, we must be against everything that they are for and in favor of everything they are against.
Right. 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 That makes sense. And coming back to India, when you, because I always like talking about your book, Decolonizing the Hindu Mind, because I read it just before I went off to
Mhm.
college. I pulled it out of I was just sitting at home during summer vacations, and I pulled it out of my dad's library, and I read it. And before reading it, there were a couple of pieces of the puzzle in my head about some things that I used to think, and that book really helped me put together the puzzle really well. When you wrote that book, did you have certain expectations from that book? If you did, what were they?
No, no, I didn't have expectations. I mean, that was the book version of my PhD thesis.
Oh wow!
So at the time, my only concern was to get that degree and writing the truth about it. But I mean, I didn't expect anything from Indians. Then there was an opportunity to get it published in India. Okay, that was fine, but I didn't think beyond that. I
Right,
didn't have the ambition, certainly, of exerting any influence.
right. Because I do feel like a lot of the things that you wrote in that book, particularly about the anti-India rhetoric that you wrote about in your book, the
Yeah.
the anti-Hindu rhetoric that you wrote in your book, it hasn't really evolved much. They still use pretty much the same arguments that you hear against India and the Hindus today that you used to hear in your book. Is that a bit of a surprise to you that the line of attack has not evolved at all?
Well, I have never seen anything happening that should have made the line change.
Hmm.
You see, if in the West they had known more about, particularly the Ayodhya situation,
Right.
the Ayodhya situation that has really mobilized many academics who were like, skeptical of Hinduism, but they didn't care. And
Hmm.
then they became actively hostile.
Right.
Like Sheldon Pollock writes it, you see that it is the Ayodhya Affair that really made him militantly critical of, let's say Hindutva, but in fact Hinduism as such.
Right.
Um, so nothing has happened that would make the West more informed, you know, because there is a bottleneck in the information flow from India, bottleneck which is entirely controlled by the enemy.
Hmm.
Of course, the government could make a lot of difference, but they don't really.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that's a pretty common criticism of the government that, that you've been in power for such a long time now with such an absolute majority. I think you have to do a better job of communicating your point of view, not
Mhm.
just to Indians, which I think they're relatively good at, but I think outside of India particularly, I think they have to do a much better job of communicating what they mean by, their version of Hindutva, whatever they consider it to be.
Mhm.
I think that is a good point. And you know, because of the success, let's say, that the BJP and the quote unquote Hindutva party has seen in the last couple of general elections, did you, when you were writing that book, did you think there would be a time when a openly Hindu party would be able to enjoy the kind of political dominance that it has in India right now?
Well, yes, you see, during the 90s, there was a clear evolution towards, in favor of the BJP.
Right.
And so the real breakthrough moment was the Ayodhya Affair. So in 1989, they went from 2 seats in parliament to 86.
Right.
Then in 91, they went to, I don't know, 130 or so. Then they became the principal opposition party. Then in 96, they really broke through. And then in 98, they were in power. So, I thought at that time that would be it. That under Modi, they gained as much power as they have done.
Mm.
Becoming able to govern without allies that constrained the Vajpayee government a lot. No, that I had not foreseen. You see that with a movement that even among Hindus is hardly majoritarian,
Right.
you could still gain that large a parliamentary majority that I had not expected. But I must say that I thought it was a very good thing for India that this happened, especially, 2014 was already something of a surprise. 2019, there I watched the election proceedings,
Right.
and so it was one pleasant surprise after another. You see, I was in America at the time, and so this was at night, and in a few hours this was all covered.
Right.
So, for instance, the defeat of the communists. You see, they had nothing left in Bengal.
Yeah.
In Kerala, they lost all seats except one. Then this Kanhaya Kumar, who was a communist candidate, he lost. And so on. So that was really surprising. But, and then, of course, the BJP majority, the way that they surprised everyone by becoming even bigger than expected. But especially what really warmed my heart was the victory of Sadhvi Pragya and the defeat of Digvijay Singh.
Right.
You see, that was such an enthusiastic gesture of Hindu-mindedness from the electorate. This fellow who had engineered this vicious Hindu terror scam, and then one of his victims defeating him.
Right.
That was wonderful.
So what makes you say that, you were very happy and you thought it was a very good thing that the BJP was able to, get a full majority on its own? Was it because you wanted to see a certain level of Hindu consolidation to happen to be able to, sort of break the back of Muslim communalism, or was it a number of different things?
Well, I don't expect that much. I wrote my first critical book of the RSS BJP in 1997. So I've never thought that much about them. A friend of mine at the time, he died long ago, Abhas Kumar Chatterjee. He said at that time, or like 94 or so, he said, the BJP is only the Congress B team. So
Right.
don't expect too much from them. So I didn't expect too much. Anyway, it's a good thing that they won. First of all, a clear majority is a good thing as such, because then you get a party in power that is able to govern. Now, nevertheless, having the Congress in power is not always a good thing. I mean, it could be, you see, because the Congress tries to be all things unto all men, and depending on the circumstances, they may do something pro-Hindu,
Yeah, yeah, like in
like
Madhya Pradesh.
yeah,
Yeah,
like this Nara Singh Rao did in the field of economics at least the right things, and even on the Hindutva front, he was not as anti-Hindu as he claimed to be in front of the cameras.
right.
I mean, like he allowed the demolition of the Babri Masjid. That was not, he could have done otherwise. But today you see, for instance, under the Modi government, that Rahul Gandhi claims to be a Janeu-wearing Brahmin.
It's a Shiv Bhakt, yeah.
Yeah, a Shiva. Yes, right.
Yeah, amazing.
So that they didn't do in 2010 or so.
Yeah.
So you see, with Congress, I don't know. It's not as. I mean, I don't care about people who talk about we need a Congress Mukt Bharat.
Right.
We have to liberate India from Congress. No, you could get a lot worse than Congress.
Oh, certainly.
But like you've seen in 2004, 2009, you had the Congress Communist combined, really aggressively anti-Hindu policies, like the Right to Information Act, Right to Education Act. But still, you see, in that anti-Hindutva enthusiasm of this 10-year period of the Manmohan Singh government, really seriously anti-Hindu things were being done. Like, you see, they actually considered a law, it didn't pass, to hold Hindus automatically guilty in the case of communal conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible. That's an open encouragement to the minorities to start riots.
Yeah.
So things like that, then I would prefer the BJP to be in power. Right. Because it hasn't really done anything for the Hindus, but at least it's not doing anything against the Hindus. That's already a big step forwards.
Yeah, I agree. With, one of the things that's been interesting, and I when I look at your Twitter profile, I see mentions about this as well. One of the things that's been interesting since the rise of the BJP, since Hindutva has become quote unquote mainstream, is within the Hindutva movement as well. Like, people like to think, people outside the Hindutva movement or that are very anti-Hindutva, they like to think of the Hindutva movement as a very strict monolith. But that is certainly not the case. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the terminology, but there seem to be a big, I suppose, two big camps within the Hindutva system these days. One tends to be the Rayatas, which are sort of the more progressive wing of the Hindutva movement, and the Trads, which are known as the traditionalists, I suppose. Is that just a process, a natural process of the evolution of a society, the evolution of a political, cultural movement like Hindutva, that you see these kinds of like ossifications between traditionalists and the progressives? Because I remember you were talking about it on Twitter the other day about, I think there was a tweet, something about the traditionalist Adhikar crowd is essentially sort of helping the assailants of Hinduism and providing them with fodder. Do you consider that to be like a serious issue, or do you think that this is just one of those things where it's like a mutton?
Well, it's a good question, and I find it difficult to give you the real answer because I do not have my finger on the pulse of Indian public opinion.
Sure.
And so, to some extent, you see, I'll be mesmerized by the bubble that I'm in. You see, among intellectuals who care about these ideological issues, most people don't. And so, to what extent they care about, what I see as the problem, well, I don't know. I mean, I hear many voices on Twitter. You get the vocal crowd.
Right.
but
Of course.
they're a minority. And so I'm not sure, like, the fact that they don't do anything pro-Hindu, whereas there is a real need to do that. And now you have a window of opportunity to do it. You have
Right.
almost a two-thirds majority. Even changes in the constitution where you need a two-thirds majority are possible in the sense that case by case you may attract certain opposition parties. And I don't think that is ever going to come back or within the foreseeable future. So there are certain things you have to do now. And I don't mean declaring a Hindu Rashtra. That's silly symbol politics.
Right.
That only makes you enemies. And whereas it doesn't yield anything tangible. No, and I don't even mean common civil code. I'm all in favor of a common civil code. Nevertheless, that's an issue that the secularists ought to deal with.
Yeah.
That's not
Well,
that
you
for
would think
Hindus.
so,
That's
right?
not
But
important.
that
Yeah,
hasn't really panned out. You would think so.
right. So the most important things are restoring control for the Hindus over their education and over their temples. Now, the temples issue is a very complex issue, very differentiated to different states. Some have to do with the erstwhile princely states. Some are legacies that, earmark a new temple for this particular caste or so. Is this still legal? Is this not? And so it's very, very complicated. It's real stuff for lawyers. But, so I only want to talk about the general principle here. Of course, you see, the users of the temple should be in control of the temple. The argument against that is always, oh yeah, but there was such a lot of corruption. I can't judge that. But okay, let's say that that's true. Well, you see, in economic life, there are all kinds of controls, you see, to prevent corruption. And so, you can apply those systems in temple management as well. You can make them more transparent.
Right.
So with that little provision, the very principle of Hindu autonomy over temples, that's obvious. And so the BJP is doing the opposite. Like in Uttarakhand, they have very recently nationalized dozens of temples.
Wow.
So they're behaving the same as Congress.
Yeah.
Or as anyone you see who just wants to loot the temple money. So you see there that should be restored, and it's very important because if the temples can flourish, they can do a lot of things for society.
Yes.
I mean, in history, they used to be centers of culture, of learning, and so on. They can be that again. Then secondly is education. That's extremely important in the modern age. You see, in the past, you could say, yeah, well, they become Hindu because it's in the air. Everything refers to it. The stories that their grandmothers tell them and so on, everything refers to it. The schools are not important. And so at the time, Hindu parents used to send their children to mission schools, not in the least worried that they're going to be converted or something, because everything else still made them Hindu.
Yeah.
Now, you see that is less and less the case. Education today is far more important everywhere in the world than it was in the past. They watch TV, and what they see is not very Hindu anymore.
Yeah.
They dream of becoming a Bollywood star and so on. This has all nothing to do with Hinduism.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in a modern state, a democracy, the state has far more power over the lives and the minds of its citizens than any monarchy, any dictatorship in the past.
Yeah.
Because, there is far more state initiative, state regulation, and so on than there used to be. And therefore, it is very important to control the formal education system. I mean, if you leave that in the hands of your enemies, you're just going to lose your next generation.
Yeah.
So it's very important now. Here, the Constitution militates against it, especially Article 30, which, gives the right to their own education to the minorities.
Right.
Now, when that article was voted in the Constituent Assembly, Hindus were completely in power because this was just after independence. The Christians had lost their British patrons. They were very afraid of decolonization. At the very same time in China, when the Maoists were taking power, the missionaries were being expelled if they were very, very, very lucky.
Right.
Mostly they were imprisoned or killed. Right? So this could have happened in India.
Yeah.
So you see, the Christians were not too loud at the time. The only thing they did was to lobby to make sure that the Constitution provided the right to convert,
Right.
which it did. They successfully lobbied.
Yeah.
And then the Muslims just had covered themselves in the guilt for partition. So they too at the time were very compliant. Like, for instance, in the language committee, there was a Muslim speaker who favored Sanskrit,
Wow.
against Muslim interests. And so at the time, you see, Hindus could have done anything they wanted. Now, if they voted for this article, they, of course, had in mind that any rights conferred on the minorities are automatically taken to also count for the majority.
Right.
However, under Indira, that interpretation was changed, and from then on, you get open discrimination against the Hindus. Like in the Right to Education Act, it is said that, you see, this duty to pay for the education of poor children and so on counts for Hindu schools, but not for Christian or Muslim schools. So this open anti-Hindu discrimination, this has a very negative effect. First of all, there is the discrimination itself, but then it creates within Hindu society a scramble for the exit.
Yeah.
So you get the situation of Arya Samaj, Ramakrishna Mission, the Veera Shaivas and so on, who try to be declared non-Hindu. So, for the well-being of Hindu society, it's absolutely necessary that this changes. Now, I don't see any initiative in that direction on the part of the BJP government.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism, and I think that's a serious issue that needs to be talked about. I think one of the other problems people raise with the BJP, which I think is also a very legitimate issue, is the problem that the fixing the law and order situation, essentially, because the current law and order situation essentially, I feel like every single democratic nation in the planet needs to ensure that the state has the monopoly on violence. But unfortunately, in India, that's not the case. In India, communities still, if they're unhappy about something, gather a few people and essentially take over a little neighborhood just through sheer violence. And it takes a long time for police to get the area under control. And because certain communities are able to still carry out violence like that, they can still hold communities, towns, cities, neighborhoods to ransom. And until the law and order situation is not fixed, unfortunately, that cycle of violence will continue. So I think that's another big issue that the BJP should be looking at, but they're not, unfortunately. But what I wanted to ask you, Dr. Elst, is, I was reading an article on Swarajya a couple of days ago, and then one of your tweets showed up on my timeline, and it also shared the same article, which I thought was funny, but it kind of talked about how to define India as a country, especially in like the English-speaking world's eyes, because when somebody in the United States or somebody in England, let's say, the English-speaking world, tries to describe India, tries to describe the Indian political system or the BJP and the Congress, they look at it in very sort of right and left terms. Right and left terms, the way they're used in the context of the United States.
Yeah.
Similarly, when they talk about India, they talk about it in very sort of mechanical terms. Oh yeah, secular democracy. That's what India is.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of secular democracies on the planet. And what separates India? When you ask them, they don't really seem to have an answer. And even among the Indian left, there isn't a good answer as to when I ask them to describe India, they say, well, we love secularism, we love our constitution. And I'm like, well, that's the case with so many other countries. What makes India different? What makes India India? And how would if you were to describe India to an English speaking person who did not know India, how would you describe India?
Well, it has a natural pluralism,
Right.
of which Mani Shankar Ayar said, he's a Congress ideologue,
Yeah.
that there is something in the air in India, something undefinable that makes India pluralistic.
Yeah.
No. You see, that something in the air is called Hinduism.
Exactly.
It's not Islam or Christianity that makes it pluralistic. But it's not secular. Like, you see, for instance, we mentioned the Common Civil Code.
Yeah.
You see, on Common Civil Code, the issue with secularism is extremely simple. You see, all citizens are equal before the law, regardless of religion.
Yeah.
That's how it is in truly secular countries. That's not how it is in India. India is not a secular country.
Yeah.
And then the meaning of the word secularism is very different in India from what it is in the rest of the world. You see, secularism in practice simply means anti-Hindu. Now, I put together this series of testimonies about Sitaram Goel after he died. I called it India's only communalist. Because, he would, introduce himself, I am a Hindu communalist.
Right.
whereas everyone else is assuring everyone, I'm a secularist.
Very far from it. Yeah.
Like Syed Shahabuddin, he was always into secularism. He called his paper Muslim India. Nevertheless, he claimed to be for secular India.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, even an out and out fundamentalist calls himself a secularist. The missionaries, and so on, they call themselves secular. Everyone who is anti-Hindu calls themselves secular.
Yeah.
And then the Hindus themselves, they call themselves, positively secular or real secularists.
Real secular. Yeah, that's a common one. Yeah.
And like in the 90s, there was a campaign by the Vishwa Hindu Parishad saying Hindu India, secular India.
Yeah.
Now, what they meant was those virtues that are attributed in India to secularism are in fact about pluralism, about tolerance and so on. Those virtues belong to Hinduism.
Yeah.
And so it is in that sense that you could say Hindu India, pluralistic India. That would have been more apt. But so, given the changed meaning that secularism has in India, well, maybe it was a good slogan. But at any rate, it stems from the psychology of, we have to hurry, to look secular.
Yeah.
Not that this is convincing anyone, Hindus are not fooling anyone except themselves.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with secularism. You see, it's a very confusing term because the rest of the world thinks India is a secular country, which it is not.
Yeah, unfortunately, that term secularism has, there's a very insidious meaning attached to the term in India. I don't think it means anywhere else in the world what it means in India, unfortunately. But when, and I feel like this is a question that I've thought about a while, that when we're talking about what India is, what India should describe itself as, it should not describe itself as a secular country. It is, it has secular laws. It should absolutely, in a legal sense, be treating every single citizen the same. Absolutely. No doubt about that. But in terms of like how the country presents itself to the world. And I think the BJP has been guilty of this a little bit as well, where they're trying very hard to present like this secularist image to the world, that we're even bigger secularists than the Congress party themselves. But in presenting themselves to the world, I feel like in that article it made a very interesting comparison between the BJP and the Christian Democrats of, let's say, Germany. Do you agree with that comparison? Do you think there are similarities there, that India should probably also present itself as a democratic country, as a pluralistic country that believes in secular values and the rule of law, while maintaining very strongly that the country's identity and the country's soul and the country's culture is very deeply tied to its Hindu civilization?
Well, I think that comparison with the Christian Democrats, which was I myself have used it. I think
Right.
in India it was mostly made known by Swapan Das Gupta. Anyway, I mean it's around, but this comparison is only made by Hindus. You see, in Europe, no Christian Democrat is going to say, "Oh yeah, they are our natural counterpart in India."
Right.
No.
Is it because they just don't know? Is it because they just don't?
It is
it
largely because they
know?
don't know, effectively. Then, well, in the case of Christian Democrats, there is also the circumstance that in India, you do have Christians who are up in arms against the Hindus.
Sure.
That also, creates a certain image for India. In the Western media nowadays, Muslim political parties in the Muslim world, like the party Ennahda in Tunisia, are in our media systematically described as the Muslim Democrats.
Right.
They don't call themselves that, but the Western media, give them that label.
Right.
And they don't do that for the BJP. So, if they're not really going overboard and calling the BJP fascist and so on, they will at least, if they try to be fair, they will at least call them Hindu nationalist.
Right. Right.
And that is another term that is problematic, because you see, nationalism was a big thing in the 19th century and even after the First World War. Because you see, at that time, all the young men had been in the army, and there was a fashion of doing everything army style. Even musical bands, even sports associations and so on, they walked in parades in uniform and so on. So that's a habit, in fact, that you see back in the RSS, that also took this habit of being in uniform with a brass band.
Right.
So that's just really the fashion of after the First World War. Then, the West has changed in that regard. The Second World War was still, just like the first, was all about nationalism, in the sense that in the resistance movements against the Nazis, you had, of course, the communists who were internationalists, but you had also, and in most countries to a larger extent, nationalist resistance, like General Charles de Gaulle in France. They were very patriotic and so on.
Yeah.
And so, but that didn't count in the general image after the Second World War, because it is also the nationalists, the National Socialists and the fascists who had called themselves nationalists. In fact, the word Nazi is shorthand for national, nationaalsocialistisch.
Right.
And so from then onwards, nationalism had a negative image. And so in India, somehow, the RSS never noticed. So they continued on their steam from 1925, that they were nationalists.
Right.
And so the word has a very different connotation in India than in the West. There is also the circumstance that the West mostly didn't go through a process of decolonization. In India, nationalist meant in favor of decolonization, meant anti-colonial. Now, in the West, you see, people will say yes. If you ask them, "Are you anti-colonial?" or "Yes, yes, colonialism was a mistake," blah blah blah. Now, if you could explain to Westerners what we mean by nationalist, it means anti-colonial, then they would have a different view. But again, they don't know.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I do think the term Hindu Democrats, I feel it has the potential to sit better with a foreign audience as well, as compared to Hindu nationalists or even nationalists. I do agree with that point. I think it's a very good observation. Final couple of things, Dr. Elst. One of the things that I've noticed in the United States particularly, I don't know how prevalent this is in the US, but I've noticed that a section of the Hindutva movement, or not even people that aren't necessarily part of the Hindutva movement, but a section of Hindus, let's say, they have wondered, rightly so, why they have not gotten a seat at the woke table, at the social justice table. Everybody has a seat at the social justice table except for Hindus. And they wondered, and so in that wondering, in trying to get a seat at the social justice table, maybe with perfectly good intentions, they have attempted to use the language of social justice in order to maybe attempt to ingratiate themselves to the social justice and get a seat at the table.
Yeah.
I don't know how effective that strategy could be, even though I think it's a clever strategy. It's a clever attempt. 100%. I see what they're trying to do. They're trying to beat the social justice warriors at their own game. I understand that completely. But I just don't think that this is a strategy that can work because of how ingrained sort of anti-Hindu sentiment is within the social justice framework. Do you think that is a strategy that can work?
Well, it's a clever strategy. In fact, on Twitter, as you read along, you may have noticed that it's only the last few days that I've interacted with a few of the people who try that strategy.
Yes.
And so, they're very clever at it, but indeed, I doubt if it's going to have an impact. Or maybe I underestimate them. But still, at the moment, I don't see it have an impact at any rate. Like you see, just now there was an open letter to Rutgers University, where Audrey Truschke is employed.
Of course.
So, she writes in favor of Aurangzeb and so on. And so they wanted the university to sort of, rein her in. So the university is not doing that.
Yeah.
So, whatever language they may use, and so there they use the language of indigenousness, we are the natives, and, this is a colonial thing that is being used against us and so on. This is all very right. But nevertheless, the woke crowd doesn't, is deaf in that ear. They don't see it that way.
Yeah.
And so what is ingrained in them, and you find it very hard to dislodge that.
Yeah.
I don't exclude it's possible in the long run, but right now, in their scheme of things, Hindus are the whites of India.
Is there a way at all to maybe, if not convince them entirely that that's not the case, but to maybe change their mind? What will it take, do you think? Like, what should be the strategy that Hindus should maybe adopt in order to at least attempt to change their minds? Or do you think that that's not something that the Hindus should be bothering themselves about at all?
Yeah, well, I must say that until now, I haven't really considered that possibility. So I don't have a definitive answer. I'll think about it with you. Now, what you can do, like the Hindu Human Rights Group in London, for instance, is hammering on this. You should get away from the rhetoric of right wing.
Mm,
Many Hindus in India call themselves right wing. And
mm,
they say, you see, this is just buying into a political scheme that is used in the West that has its
yeah,
history, the French Revolution, and so on. And that just doesn't apply to India. So you should get away from that language. And a language that will make Hindus a lot more, interesting and more look like the good guys in the eyes
right.
of the world is to use the language of indigenousness.
Mm,
We are the indigenous culture. We are being bullied by outsiders. And so the application of social justice categories to India today is a new form of colonialism.
mm,
Back then, you see, the colonialists used to say, yeah, we know better, what is good for you. We are going to tell you how to do things.
right.
Well, that's exactly what the social justice warriors today also do.
Yeah.
That's kind of a form of colonialism. So against that, you should really affirm your indigenousness.
Mm,
So that's a good thing. Now, to what extent will it work? Well, at the moment, you're up against an enormously intense anti-Hindu position
yeah.
because, in fact, it goes back to what I said earlier about the general Western distrust of Hinduism.
Mm,
Here, in the woke crowd, it is far more intense, far more concentrated, because most of Western society doesn't really care about India. They have
yeah.
some vague notion about caste, blah, blah, but they don't really know and they don't really care.
Yeah.
These people care. And so what they see is that you see the caste system, of course. They say Hindutva is an upper caste thing.
Mm,
So, even if there are lower caste Hindus, yeah, but, they are not the ones we are concerned with. The lower caste Hindus, at any rate, had better convert away from Hinduism.
right.
And so the upper caste people are oppressors. Moreover, they can't really play the indigenousness card because they are not indigenous.
Right.
They are themselves early colonizers in the Aryan invasion. Now, that's like 4,000 years ago. It's a little bit ridiculous to say that they are conquerors and outsiders, but
Right.
that's what happened. Then they, apart from oppressing the lower castes, they are also oppressing the non-Hindus,
Mm,
including the saintly Muslim community. So, or Audrey Truska's Christian community.
of course.
So, those are all factors. Then there is the situation of Hindus in the West. You see, in Britain, you had the Hindus were strongly with the Labour Party
Right.
until some 7 years ago, when they made almost a collective move, as advised by the local Hindu leader Satish Sharma,
Mm,
towards the Conservative Party, which was a very good move.
I agree.
It probably, with the Theresa May election, the Conservatives won very narrowly, and I think the Hindu vote was decisive.
Yeah.
Then, under Boris Johnson, they have 3 prominent cabinet ministers. So for the Hindu cause, it was really good, because the Labour Party is now pretty much a pro-Pakistani party.
Right.
Hindus had no business there anymore. Then also there is the sociological evolution. When Hindus came to Britain, they had to start below, like in Tanzania or so. They had been successful businessmen. They lost everything. They
Right.
came to Britain penniless. They started below. They started as news agents, for instance, typically. But then you see they became wealthier and they became more leadership class.
Right.
Their children went to university. They did very well in education and so on. So right now they're a naturally conservative group.
Right.
Similarly, in America, they were economically very successful. So you don't associate them with the plight of blacks or the Mexican lawnmower and these menial jobs. That's not
Right.
what Hindus do. So you simply don't associate them with the good guys in the woke scheme
That's
of
true.
things.
Yeah.
So you have everything against you at the moment.
Yeah.
But yes, I don't exclude that in the long run, you see, reclaiming those terms from them may become successful.
What do you now looking at the position that the BJP is in, the mainstreaming of Hindutva in a sense, have you given much thought to what the political future of India looks like maybe in about a decade or so? Like, do you think that we're still going to be looking in 10 or 15 years at the same kind of like extremely quote unquote secular left wing versus like something like the BJP? Or do you think that the extremely left wing can survive in the current atmosphere? Or do they need to maybe evolve their tactics?
First of all, you say mainstreaming Hindutva. Well, I don't see it that way.
Right.
You
I
see,
understand. Yeah.
it is not the BJP that is changing the secular system. It is the secular system that is changing the BJP.
Right.
And so they are not in power; they are in office.
Right.
That's
I think it's
once
a very good.
long ago, when I was talking with Arun Shauri and some others. I said the usual thing that all people say about politicians are interested in power. He corrected me. They are interested in office.
Right.
They want the perks of office. They want to show off to their family. You see, oh, I can get you a job.
Yeah.
Look no farther. You see, I'm a powerful man. And look what I can do. But you see, power means that you try to change things according to your design.
Yes.
Really power conscious in India have been the communists. When Indira Gandhi was in trouble with the Congress Party, there was another wing in the Congress Party.
Right.
And so she counted on the communists to prop her up. And so the deal was that, she and her son Sanjay could get all the posts they want and so on, that they could keep for themselves. But the control over culture and education, that is what the communists wanted, because that's where real power lies.
Yeah.
So
That's
you see, the
absolutely true.
BJP never has shown that instinct of changing the system according to their own design. So I wouldn't say Hindutva is being mainstream. That's the perception created by the media. They speak of saffronization. I don't see any saffronization. I don't see anything being saffronized. But so they create that image. And so there is an interesting complicity between the BJP and the media,
Yeah.
in the sense that the media create the image that the BJP is a Hindu party. The
Right.
BJP itself is constantly denying that. It's constantly saying, no, we are for development.
Right.
Now, you see, nobody listens. The media
Right.
don't care. They still call them saffron and everything.
Right.
And that's good for the BJP, because that's why people vote for them. They
Yeah.
don't vote for development. I mean, any party promises development. I
Right.
admit that the BJP is a little bit better at delivering it. But you see, I mean, nobody waxes enthusiastic for that.
Right.
Nobody's going to volunteer as an election worker or so for them for development. They want to serve Hinduism. That's why they serve the BJP.
Right.
So it is very good for them to have that image of being a Hindu party, but they themselves don't have to do that. It's the enemy that
does it
gives
for
them
them.
that image. Yes. But so they themselves don't do any Hindu input. Like, you see, one thing that all the BJP militants are going to object here is, but the change in Kashmir. You see, in 2019, the BJP normalized the situation of Kashmir. And so, I mean, it was not some authoritarian majoritarian coup d'etat or something. No, 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 no.
Right.
It was just a normalization. You see, I mean, no other country, not even Pakistan, has a system where a certain part of the country is off limits to all its other citizens.
Yeah.
So it was just a renormalization, nothing else. However, and so it's a good thing. Of course, I was also very happy when this happened.
Right.
Nevertheless, it could only happen with this, secular-minded BJP. It could only happen because the Kashmir situation nowhere mentions religion.
Mm.
You see, Kashmir is given a special status. Everybody knows that it has to do with its Muslim majority.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the law doesn't say that. So, you can simply do that renormalization in the name of nationalism,
Yeah.
of national unity and integrity. That's RSS language.
Yeah.
And so, in this case, it's okay. I have nothing against it. The achievement itself is so important that I don't care what language they put it in. But so they could only do it because even though in reality very pro-Hindu, it didn't, have that name tag of pro-Hindu.
Yeah.
Indians know this. The rest of the world doesn't know. But so at least, you see, this to their own minds, this they could get away with.
Yeah.
Whereas coming out and actually doing something pro-Hindu, I don't see the BJP doing.
Right.
Like what I mentioned of changing the constitution to abolish the anti-Hindu discriminations is very easy to do, at least if you have this majority. Because you see things like, for instance, the Citizenship Act, triggered quite a bit of opposition. Now here, because there you had to impose a religious discrimination, which was entirely reasonable. I mean, if you're going to give asylum to the refugees, then that doesn't imply also giving asylum to their persecutors.
Right, exactly.
Nevertheless, it provoked a lot of opposition and a lot of bad press worldwide. Now here, abolishing the discriminations, well, is far more easy to do and far easier to gain acceptance for, because you are not taking away anything from the minorities. You don't mention the minorities.
Exactly.
You simply make sure that Hindus have the same rights. So you're not doing this in the name of Hindu Rashtra or something. No, you do it in the name of equality. Now, who can be against equality?
Yeah.
Now, mind you, the extremists, the woke crowd, are still against equality. They are for equity. And so they will say that, oh yeah, but equality in fact means Hindu majoritarianism and so on. They're going to try to spin it in a way that it still becomes negative.
Of course.
But I'm not so sure that this is going to carry much conviction. Not in sane grow-up country, not in China, not in Russia and so on. Maybe in America a little bit. But that they can easily do. And so because they are not taking away anything from the minorities, they should normally be able to do it without, getting a wave of riots and so on.
Yeah.
They should pass easily and have enormous consequences.
Yeah.
Because then many Hindu organizations will get active in education and so on. This will really change the situation. Yeah. This can be contrasted, for example, with another demand of the BJP or of the historical BJP. The present BJP is not doing anything about it. Is a common civil code. You see, many of these Twitter, this Twitter crowd and so on are saying, we need a common civil code.
Yeah.
Well, that common civil code makes really no difference. It outlaws a bit of Muslim polygamy. That's really what they mean. But that doesn't make much difference. That Muslim polygamy is also limited to a small slice and so on. Of course, I think that marriage laws should be the same for everyone. So in the long run, of course, there should be a common civil code. Nevertheless, at the moment, with the BJP being so afraid of being seen as Hindu and so on,
As a
and
communalist,
absolutely not wanting to look, overbearing against the minorities and so on, they will not be able to withstand the storm that is going to be unleashed.
yeah,
Because, if you impose a common civil code, it means you take away the power of the Muslim clergy within the Muslim community.
yeah,
And so they're going to be up in arms in every mosque in India.
yeah,
Far, far, far more seriously than with this citizenship.
yeah,
So you see, spare yourself that. If you become stronger and so on, you may consider that in the long run.
yeah.
But now concentrate on the really consequential and at the same time easy issues.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that's a very good point as well. And very finally, Dr. Elst, there was a question here before I let you go from my patrons as well. Here's one from the Mad Titan Thanos. He says, "Has the Aryan invasion theory been? Is the Aryan invasion theory considered to be debunked? If yes, where can we find scholarly papers and findings of the results? Because I still do see multiple debates happening across platforms online and real time on this theory." So, what do you think? Like, is it still accepted as a legitimate theory outside?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So it has not
Absolutely.
been debunked.
No,
Right.
there are. I think it has been debunked. And so, I've written myself a number of papers, and there is this collection book, Still No Trace of an Aryan Invasion, published by Aryan Books International 2 years ago. And so, that you can check. There is and that's what really needs to be mentioned. Shrikant Talageri's work.
Right.
So both he and me, our papers can be checked on academia.edu
Okay.
or on our own blog sites. Then Talageri's work is especially important because he does more than all the others. What we have done is to show that in linguistics, in archaeology, and also in genetics now, as against the impression that there is proof for the Aryan invasion, there is a lot of counterproof.
Right.
However, that's not, that's inference. From linguistics, you can't deduce much. And linguists also admit this. Like my professor of Indo-European linguistics back in my student days already said, well, linguistics can't prove this, but there is proof which is from archaeology.
Right.
Now, you see, at the time that was the status quo, the state of the art, but that's and that was based on a single archaeological finding by B.B. Lal, which supposedly proved that the painted gray ware kind of pottery was typical for the Aryans on the move deeper into India. Now, later he saw and he made public that he was only trying to comply with the reigning paradigm, which was the Aryan invasion.
Right.
But then, in fact, there was no proof at all. And now he says openly, Vedic and Harappan are just two sides of the same coin. Right. The Vedic people were already here. And so, the Indian archaeologists, of course, have done a lot in showing not so much that there was an emigration from India, but at least in proving that there is no sign at all of an immigration into India. Right? So anyway, we've done our best, but this is nothing compared to Talageri's contribution, which is that there is in human language a testimony of the Aryan or Indo-European emigration from India. And so nobody thought that this existed because the idea was, okay, Proto-Indo-European was spoken like 6,000 years ago. And the earliest writing in Indo-European languages are from about 3,500 years ago. So a long distance from when it really happened. So
Right.
what he shows is that the Vedas go back a lot farther. And so they have a reminiscence of the earliest emigrations from India, the earliest split-offs from Proto-Indo-European, and they actually describe the split between Iranian and Indo-Aryan,
Mm.
with the Iranians emigrating from India. So first they were in India and they are described as being part of India,
Right.
and then they leave. So that changes the situation completely. And
Right.
so that really means that there is not something you have to interpret like the archaeological data. No, you see, that describes in human language by
Mm.
eyewitnesses what is
Mm.
happening. So yes, you see, there is of course real proof for the out of India theory against
Right.
the Aryan invasion theory, but that has not been accepted at all
Right.
in Western universities, and therefore also in Chinese, Japanese, and so on universities.
Sure.
They still teach unquestioned the Aryan invasion scenario.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, that's incredible. So I hope people get a chance to go take a look at Dr. Elst's work and Shrikant Talageriji's work. And very finally, before I let you go, Dr. Elst, you were talking about, courses that you teach, and some people had asked me about whether or not, if they're able to join the courses that you teach. Is that possible? And if it's possible, where can they join those courses?
Right now, I am teaching about the Aryan invasion question in the
Oh, there you go.
Indology Academy in Houston. So organized by Mr. Rajiv Verma, and they are welcome there.
Okay.
Absolutely. So
So
next year,
where can they go to, like a website or something, or how do they look for it?
yes. So it's called Indology Academy, and then you can add, Houston or Rajiv Verma.
Okay.
That will certainly get you there.
Okay.
Or you Google for my name, and you'll run into some announcement of this.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Els, for speaking to me today. Before I spoke to you, I was thinking that hopefully we can get some, even for the so-called Hindutva crowd, we can give them some food for thought. And I think especially in terms of what the BJP should be prioritizing and what the Hindutva movement should be prioritizing, I think we've helped them give some food for thought to them. So once again, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me today, Dr. Elst.
Yes, pleasure to meet.
Absolutely. Thank you. And guys, as usual, I'll leave links to Dr. Elst's blog and his Twitter in the bio of this video. You can go check it out. This video will be available as a podcast later on as well, so keep an eye out for that as well. And Dr. Elst, just stick with me just for a second offline. But other than that, guys, thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, go follow Dr. Elst, and I will catch you next time. Bye-bye.